Hello, thank you for joining us online today for Alan Shapiro's presentation on Science Communication in Water, Principles and Best Practices. My name is Meg Olson, and I'm the Manager of Operations and Communication for the Canadian Water Resources Association. I just have a couple of notes for you all, and then I will turn the session over to Alan. First, we are recording this presentation, and the presentation slides and the recording will be posted on our website afterwards. Everyone who registered will also receive a copy of the recording tomorrow in an email. We will be taking questions for this presentation after Alan is finished speaking. If you have a question or a comment at any time, please type it into the questions tab on your control panel. During the talk, I'm going to post a couple of links just in case you want to click on those or save them to follow up. So check under the questions heading for those links as well. Now I'm going to quickly introduce Alan, and then he will take it from here. Alan Shapiro is a Vancouver-based water sustainability and science communication professional with a background in hydrogeology and water policy. Alan teaches science communication at Simon Fraser University and sustainable business at the BC Institute of Technology. He also runs an independent consultancy dedicated to supporting purpose-driven organizations on water and sustainability challenges. Thank you for presenting with us today, Alan.
No worries. I'm looking forward to it. Are we good to get started?
Yep. Yeah, all you.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. It is a beautiful morning in Vancouver, but I also know that there's a bunch of people joining from elsewhere. So hopefully you have a chance to grab your lunch or do whatever, wherever you are. We'll take about 45 minutes today to chat about science communication and water from a few different perspectives, pulling in a little bit of climate conversation and chatting a little bit about COVID, which is our science communication backdrop for where we are now. I've got my Twitter handle on this title page here, so if you are on Twitter, that is a great way to stay in touch or chat during the event. So I want to run through science communication principles today, and then we'll chat about Cape Town as a bit of a case study. And I know some of you might be familiar with this case study, some of you might not be, and we're not really diving into day zero as what it meant for the water world in Cape Town. We're going to chat about it a little bit as a communication exercise in terms of how Cape Town was able to pull in a bunch of their citizens to change their behaviors in a very short period of time. I'm going to throw a question out to everyone. And that question is, what communication challenge are you currently facing? So I'm throwing that out as an open-ended question. And I would love if you have an answer that you want to type into the question box, into the comments box, go right ahead. If you don't have an answer that you'd like to type, that's totally fine. Just think of the answer for yourself. And this can be your work. This could be something that you're facing personally. This could be within your organization. This could be within a team that you're working with. But I find that whenever I'm chatting about science communication, it really helps me to ground by having a very concrete challenge in mind. Now for myself, I think we had our bio, the bio already, but I really live in this interesting world where my background is in hydrogeology, and I consider myself a water scientist, but I've arrived at the science communication toolkit because it's one that I've found really, really powerful in trying to take whatever research I'm working on, whatever technical solutions I'm working on, and moving them out into the world, whether that means public engagement, whether that means working with policy audiences or business audiences. To me, every form of knowledge mobilization is a communication exercise and is a fun challenge to think about. How do I take this particular message and share it with this particular audience? And so that's really informed the work that I do. So this is your specific mission above and beyond that communication challenge that you're posting in the thread right now. Choose a specific communication challenge and keep it in mind as we move through today's webinar. I just find in general that science communication strategies are a lot more helpful when they're plugged into something which is on your mind, where you can just say, oh, I see how this could be applied in the context of a specific project. What does water mean to you? I'm going to get you to take 10 seconds and think about this. So when you close your eyes and you think water, because we all come from different backgrounds. Some of you are technical professionals. Some of you might be consumers of water. Some of you might be more focused on the communication aspects of sharing water issues. What does water mean to you? Whether that's rainfall, whether that's lakes and rivers, whether that's groundwater. So get you to anchor that picture in your mind. And then also to touch base on what science communication means to you. Science communication means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, especially depending on where you come from. Whether science communication has a positive connotation in your mind, whether science communication for you is just this side of your desk thing that you do, whether science communication is something that you're trying to learn how to do. So to me, even though my background is in groundwater, I grew up spending a lot of time in the Rocky Mountains. And so that top picture is one of my favorite lakes. It's called Moraine Lake in the Rocky Mountains. And that is really what water means to me. So when I think about water, I'm mostly thinking about fresh water in pristine nature in a way that connects with people. And when I think about science communication, and I think my thinking on this has changed over time, it's gone from this traditional notion of someone talking about science on TV or someone teaching science in a classroom to being this multi-person engaged process of accessing science and moving science out into the real world. And so there is my picture on the bottom, which helps me represent what science communication means in that context to me. And I think this is really important as we chat about mental models today and we chat about audiences, understanding that communication as an exercise is really a multi-party exercise. It's about what we're communicating, but it's also about how that is understood. And this is a quote that I have started almost every communication workshop with. It's how well we communicate is determined not by how well we say things, but how well we are understood. It's a really powerful reframe to think not just about the traditional notion of communication as the thing that I have shared. So I'm in a position of being a knowledge holder and I'm trying to achieve some sort of equilibrium with the world around me and try to put knowledge into people's brains so they make better rational decisions. But in reality, that's not borne out by the evidence. What we do know from the research around science communication is that science communication is really this multi-party process where interpretation and action might be very disconnected from the intention of our communication. The other thing that I want to throw out is this. It's that whether or not we do science communication in our day-to-day work, we are all science communicators in one capacity or another in the context of living through the current coronavirus pandemic. And it's because this really is a science communication exercise. People might be coming to you in your official capacity, or even just as a friend or a colleague or a family member with questions about the coronavirus. And this is a fact-based communication exercise, one where we are intentionally or unintentionally sharing information, and often unintentionally sharing misinformation as well. So this is a great link to a blog post in The Atlantic. And by the way, all of these links that I have in the slideshow, you'll be able to access once the slideshow is sent out to you. And I definitely encourage you to do a bit more reading around it. So what is science communication? Science communication is the sharing of science-based knowledge with a specific audience in an impactful way. So let's break down all three of those. Science-based knowledge, to me, means peer-reviewed knowledge, either technical or research. And it's not the only form of knowledge. It's important to recognize that there's other forms of communication and they are just as valid. And particularly when I'm working in First Nations communities, for example, that there are traditional forms of knowledge, which don't fall into the realm of science communication, but also inform the kind of work that we do. So science communication is a very powerful toolkit, but it's based on fact-based knowledge. And often what we're competing with is misinformation. So information that intentionally or unintentionally might not be grounded in facts. Now, the second half of this, for many of us that are more traditionally grounded in terms of communication, might be a weird add-on, right? Because the process of sharing knowledge in and of itself is an act of communication. I would disagree with that. I would say that just putting information out into the world is not an act of communication. The act of communication is in having that information interact with an audience in an impactful way. Coming back to the notion of different audiences understanding messages in different ways, I might be communicating with a general public and then communicating with a policy audience, and they would interpret the same knowledge in a very different way. So having a specific audience in mind and then pushing the ball for that audience, whether it's an intended impact or often, especially if you're dealing with the general public, it might be an unintended impact, but having some sort of an impact where you walk out of the room and you've pushed the ball forward in the audience's mind on that particular topic. Now, if there's anyone with a communication background in the room, I am very sorry to just butcher communication principles left, right, and center. This is my very simplified model of what principles of communication look like. So I've got information on the left-hand side, I've got message on the right-hand side, and then I've got this weird parameter, which is the envelope, which is what I'm going to spend most of today chatting about. And it's really just to highlight the fact that we often equate information and message. But to me, those two are different things. Information is your currency of knowledge, right? If I am writing a research paper, that paper is based on information, which in itself might pull on a bunch of different data streams. But a message is a currency of communication. So a message to me is information that's been processed through thinking about what the purpose of that information is in this particular context, what the format is of this particular context, and what the audience needs in this particular conversation. And so once you've put those envelope parameters on top of your information, that's when you have a message on the other end. So purpose, audience, format, these are the three main variables, main parameters inherent in a communication exercise. And if you take anything out of today's session, it's that when you go back to your desk and you're thinking through the next communication challenge, purpose, audience, and format are three questions that I ask myself daily. Audience is the thing that you will hear from all communicators. It's know your audience. It's who is your audience. But purpose underlies that because fundamentally the purpose of educating is very different than the purpose of changing behavior or engaging an audience. Each of those purposes uses different toolkits, but being clear on what our purpose is very important for obviously being able to measure a successful outcome and also being able to achieve it. Who is the audience? We'll chat a little bit more about that in a second. And then what is the format? So social media is very different in terms of its format constraints from a traditional report, but even social media, Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and TikTok are very different social media platforms. So the more specific we can get to format, understanding best practices on each platform and understanding what format constraints each platform brings is a really powerful way to make sure that our communication is well adapted to the context in which we find ourselves. And I think there's a lot of places in the world where we find a mismatch between the type of information that we see and the format within which that information is packaged. Knowing your audience. So fundamentally, the best way to know your audience is to choose your audience. And that comes back to our purpose. There's very few situations in which you're walking into a room of people and you know absolutely nothing about them. For example, right now I'm giving a webinar and I know very little about each of you individually, but I do know a little bit about the demographics of the CWRA. I do know a little bit about the people who registered and the people who tweeted about this. And even though that's not a lot of information to go on, I have chosen the audience with the particular message that I wanted to share, right? So picking your audience is a really important part of the process. There's no such thing as indiscriminately sharing information out into the world and hoping that it resonates with someone. That's not effective communication. Now, once I have an audience in front of me, the question is, what is my audience's background, both in terms of technical background, what kind of words can I use, what kind of concepts resonate, but also values and interests and priorities. Because fundamentally, the biggest competition to the sources of information that you're trying to share are usually pictures of cats on the internet, right? So most audiences might be engaged to your message in some capacity, but they're also plugged into so many other conversations. And especially now in the time of coronavirus, where there's a lot of things on people's minds and a lot of disruptions to our day to day. It's not that we, as water communicators and environmental communicators, don't have an important message to share. It's that it's important to think about how the audience thinks and feels broadly around that message. Recognize that science communication is part of a larger network of influences for individuals and for organizations. And the conversations that I've had with policymakers to me really highlight that. It's the fact that even the best crafted science communication campaign is only one side of communication, right? But advocacy and human interest and long-term policy priorities, these are all different inputs into the process, for example, for policy. So recognize that even the best crafted science communication campaign is still only one influence on individual behavior. Pulling a little bit of psychology into this, I want to chat about mental models and particularly what that means for us as we get into talking about water and climate change. So there's no such thing as us being rational interpreters of information. We all have our own models for how the world works in our minds around particular issues. So if my mental model of myself is that I'm an environmentalist, then the way that I interpret environmental information is very different. If I'm given a choice where I can exercise my ability to be an environmentalist, or where I'm doing something that I believe is harmful to the environment, of course, I'm going to choose the choice that is beneficial. But that is based on my mental model of being an environmentalist. And what we often do is we project our mental models onto the world around us. We assume that just because we see the world in a certain way, our audiences see the world in that way as well. But in reality, we know that even around issues like climate, we have very different mental models. So the biggest predictor, for example, on stances on human influence and climate change is people's political leanings, right? Which is not for us as research professionals and technical professionals. We might say, but that has nothing to do with the fundamental information. True, but that mental model is so core to people interpreting the world that if they see themselves as being affiliated with a certain group, that is going to be the lens through which they interpret new information. By extension, people tend to prefer their existing mental models, and it takes a lot of effort to change those models. So confirmation bias is a process by which we find information or we assimilate information that agrees with our existing mental models. And this is a great exercise for those of us who think that we are impartial, that we are unbiased, that we are just great at taking in information about the world around us. I do this with my students in my science communication classes. I have them go home for a week, choose a topic, and track all of the information that comes at them in that topic. And I think a great opportunity, if you want to try this in practice, is coronavirus, because there's so much information coming at us right now that we unconsciously are just sorting that information and using our confirmation bias based on the sources of authority that we might look to or the worldviews that we might have. So, for example, for myself, looking at BC's public health officer as a source of authority, might give me a different message than if I were looking at certain political figures as sources of authority. So this is a great exercise just to think through unconsciously, how much information are we turning away and how much information are we pulling in with the intention of it reinforcing the worldview that we already have. The corollary to that, in terms of what we do as communicators, is framing. Framing is the process of grounding information within a certain context to try to help it stick and resonate with people in an intentional way. So, for example, if we talk about water issues, it's very different to talk about water issues in people's backyards. So framing something as a conversation around this is how this impacts you here now versus talking about something as a global issue. So that local versus global frame is a really, really powerful way to package your message. And though many of us don't think about this intentionally, the way we do package our message fundamentally will change how it's interpreted. Because if I see myself as just, hey, someone who lives in a community surrounded by my people and cares about my local environment, then a message about my local lake and the water quality there might resonate with me very differently than talking about a global water issue in Southeast Asia. This is one science communication process, and it is a simplified process that resonates with me. But likewise, for many of you, particularly if you're coming from different schools of thought, you might be using variations or different models for how to communicate. But if we run through the science communication process, the first step is to identify the science most relevant to the decisions that people face. This is a challenge because for those of us who are really passionate about the work that we do, we want to communicate everything. We want to communicate the cool tech that we have. We want to communicate the knowledge that we have around a particular issue. But in reality, we are our own worst enemies in this respect, that trying to share too much information with people is what's going to get them to disengage. So identifying the science most relevant to decisions that people face day to day, but also now. What is the information that people need now to make a better decision on this specific topic? Determine what people already know, which takes a lot of research and is not something to oversimplify. This is a really important part of any communication process. Then design communication to fill the critical gaps between what people know and what they need to know to make better decisions. Evaluate the adequacy of those communications, and then repeat this process again and again and again. Evaluation is core to any scientific process, but somehow we tend to ignore it for communication processes. Often what we do is we'll give conference talks and say, well, that felt pretty good. I felt like I was saying something semi-intelligible, but the evaluation, if I'm collecting data of any kind, whether that's survey data or attention data, if I'm looking at how many people drop off this webinar over the course of this hour, that is a great way to evaluate how effective the communication actually is. To be effective, communication must contain the information that your audience needs in places they can access in a form they can understand and use. And what does that mean? That means that if you published a scientific paper, it's probably not in a place that people can access in a format they can understand and use. It means that if you wrote a technical report, it's probably not in a place that people can access and in a form they can understand and use. So the communication exercise does not end there, it only begins there. So this is just one quick example of what this might look like in practice. So in this particular case, it's a climate change communication activity. And our traditional communication might be a scientist goes to the library and gives a talk on climate change and answers some audience questions. But who is the public? The public was defined by the fact that these were library goers to begin with, who are probably people who value knowledge. They're in the room, so they're probably engaged. And I'm going to make a bet that they went to listen to the scientist because they were already interested in that science. And if that works for you, great. But in terms of the purpose of that exercise, whether it's broader reach, whether it's behavior change, this might not be the best forum to do that. This is a much longer and more meticulous communication process, but in this particular case, the scientist presents at a ski resort talking about local snowpack change in the next 20 to 50 years and talking to snow sports enthusiasts. So these might be people who don't typically talk about climate science, but this is a very local conversation on something that is very relevant to them. And there's also an evaluation process here where there were questions that were asked before the talk, and then a short survey was administered afterwards to see how that talk changed people's perspectives. So this, as a communication exercise, very intentional in terms of choosing the appropriate audience, in terms of making the message relevant to that audience, and integrating some sort of evaluation component. So what about water? Well, most of these principles fundamentally underlie most of the work that I do in the water space. I do want to chat about a couple of considerations that do come up with water in particular, and a lot of those have come out of the literature around climate change communication. And it's because climate, at least in my mind, has been one of the biggest communication failures of the past decade. That's not to simplify it. And of course, there's so much misinformation and intentional misinformation, disinformation out there. However, from a communication point of view, we've spent so much time focusing on the problem and so much time focusing on education that we've sort of undermined this ability to create a shared vision, to focus on behavior change, to talk about solutions. And this has led actually to massive research programs looking at climate change communication in particular. Catherine Hayhoe, who is a climate change communication researcher, and I highly recommend looking into some of her work, really summarizes this well, talking about the most dangerous myth that people buy into being the fact that this doesn't matter to me, and the second most dangerous myth being there's nothing I can do about it. And if we think about how we communicate about water and climate issues in general, it's funny that most of our communication is education focused and doesn't actually deal with either of these as issues, right? We can put a lot of information out into the world, but that won't make it matter to people anymore. And that won't empower people to be more engaged and be more oriented towards action. So when we talk about framing in the context of water and climate communication, it's important, first of all, to clarify our own frame. Are we educating? Are we engaging? Are we trying to change behaviors? And I think this is a really, really, really key point to highlight, that if our purpose is not clear in our own minds, if we're talking about educating people when we really need them to change their behaviors, and that's our intention, then we might be using the wrong toolkit to achieve the purpose that we want to achieve. Now, some frames which are really helpful as we think about disseminating information on water and climate: promotion versus prevention. Are we trying to build towards something or away from something? Coronavirus is such a great example of this, where the promotion frame of let's be resilient and prepared for a global pandemic was a very, very different influence than there's a pandemic. How do we prevent bad things from happening to us? So these are very, very different framing decisions. And day zero as a water framing decision is a very, very prevention focused water lens onto water issues. It's how do we not run out of water? It's fear-based, which is a very powerful short-term motivator, but can often backfire in the longer term if we're trying to get people to build towards some sort of shared vision, which is what we're finding in the climate change experience, that we're missing that shared vision, that people are buying into the idea that climate change is a problem, but they haven't bought into the shared solutions that they can move towards as a country and as a world. Problem versus solution focus, that's fairly self-explanatory. So again, being focused on the problem of climate change, for example, versus solutions, even if those solutions are disconnected from our overall global system. So for example, voting as a very proximal solution to shape government policy is very empowering versus talking just about problems and not giving people the opportunity to engage. Local versus global, we've already chatted about in the water context, but water particularly gives itself to local issues, even though we might talk about day zero as a global concept of running out of fresh water. In reality, our relationships with water are very local. It's about what happens when I turn on the tap. It's about the lake that I tend to go for, my weekend trips. So that is a very local connection and benefits from very local communication strategies. And then now versus future. And that's another very powerful one to take this future concept of what does this world look like and translate into what we can do now. Because coming back to climate change, we have spent a lot of time talking about 2050, but 2050 doesn't mean a lot to people. Even if they buy into a vision, it's not tangible enough to inspire action now. So how do we have a now piece and a now framing attached to communication, perhaps hand in hand with our future piece? And then aside from the message, specifically when we're talking about environmental communication, the words are really important as well. So words fundamentally change both how communication is perceived and how it's understood. And I'm going to come back all the way to the beginning of this talk where I said, what does water mean to you? And what does science communication mean to you? Because what sustainability, for example, means to me as a sustainability professional is very different than what sustainability means to someone as they're shopping in the grocery store. And it's very different than what sustainability might mean to a policymaker. So sustainability is this very, very broad word. And we all agree that it's a great word. No one's going to say that sustainable is bad, but it doesn't necessarily have that concrete oomph that I'm trying to get at when I'm trying to inspire behavior change. Likewise, the difference between global warming, for example, and climate change. These are perhaps similar technically in terms of the processes they're referring to, but global warming talks about a process that might clash with people's local frames of it's cold here, which to a technical professional is let me explain to you the climate fundamentals that are inherent in this process. But climate change as a way to communicate that same concept is a lot more powerful because it doesn't have that same disconnect. I'm going to chat about a couple of quick water examples, and then we'll jump into talking about day zero. So this is an infographic from Metro Vancouver, and you won't be able to read the small text. I don't need you to read the small text. I want to highlight a couple of things here. One is the relevance factor. So if you look at what this infographic is showing, it's showing how water gets to people's homes. I give a lot of public talks in Vancouver. And what strikes me is that the most common questions I get are, is my water safe to drink? Even from people who are in the city and on municipal water supply and paying tax dollars to support that water supply. And the second question is, where does my water come from? So Metro Vancouver has a lot of very, very cool water treatment technology, and they could choose to communicate that. But for most people, the difference between ozone or UV treatment, the difference between one treatment plant and another isn't significant. And even if it inspires some sort of interest, it won't push behavior change. However, understanding our relationship to water really is a powerful motivator, particularly when we move into a drought like the one we had in 2015 in Vancouver. Once we start implementing water restrictions, it's really important to have that relationship to our water supply above and beyond this abstract thing that comes out of the faucet when I turn it on. The most underused tool to me, and this is one that I've seen in Vancouver, is just visiting the sources of water. A lot of people live in Vancouver because they have a shared value of nature, right? People in Vancouver are connected to nature in one way, shape, or form. And somehow, even though we have watershed tours and that the watersheds, the reservoirs are otherwise off limits, somehow those watershed tours are the best kept secret that we have as a region. I've been to two of the watersheds and they're beautiful, right? It's this pristine reservoir and it fundamentally changes your relationship with your water source to know and see and feel where your water is coming from. And then to know when it's, raining in the middle of winter and you're shaking your fist at the water falling out of the sky, that it's also the same water that's falling into your reservoirs that you will be drinking in the summer. And then talking a little bit more broadly, this is DataStream, which is one of my favorite open access data platforms in Canada, and one that I really suggest you checking out. This one is Mackenzie DataStream, which is for the Mackenzie River Basin, but they likewise have Atlantic DataStream and Lake Winnipeg DataStream currently as well. And this, to me, brings together a couple components. One, just the concept of plugging data, taking open access data and plugging that into some sort of a visual infrastructure where I can go to the platforms that I'd be on anyway, like Google Earth, but all of a sudden see what water quality data and water flow data means in that context. But also, just even making the concept of a watershed more intuitive, looking at this map and saying, wow, all of this is water that flows into the Mackenzie River Basin in a way that the concept of a watershed otherwise is just very, very abstract. And then there's also the piece here that they support community-based water monitoring work, which is coming back to that concrete relationship component of if people are collecting water in their collecting water samples and water data in their communities, they fundamentally have a different relationship to these numbers than they might otherwise just by seeing an abstract report. So let's chat a little bit about the Cape Town water crisis and day zero. Again, for those of you who are familiar with the water crisis, I am just breezing through most of it to chat about the communication aspects of it. But this paper that I've got on this slide in the bottom right, Tang and others published in 2019, is a really, really useful broad scale assessment of what the water crisis was, all of the variables and all of the solutions, and in the context of water security going forward. So if you're at all interested in this water crisis, I would highly suggest you reading this paper. But in terms of grossly oversimplifying for my current purpose, it was a period of water shortage in South Africa's Western Cape Province in 2017 and 2018. Day zero was a term that was coined in 2017, referring to the day when the water level of the dams supplying the city would fall below 13.5%, which is the level at which they would have to shut off taps for certain parts of the city, and people would have to go to supply points and refill water on their own. So this like very, very big disruption in terms of people's relationship with water. In response, Cape Town implemented a range of measures both to reduce water demand and to supplement supply, and coupled with rainfall in June 2018 eventually led to the easing of the crisis. Now, this is one day zero example, but likewise, this is a problem that has plagued South Africa for years, and not just in Cape Town, and is a problem that many big cities are currently facing, particularly in drier regions. So day zero as a concept is really starting to take off in the water community, for better or for worse. This is a graph just to help contextualize that. So you can see 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17. You've got the rainy seasons where the water supply recharges. You've got the dry seasons where the water supply dips. And you can see that in 2017, so they had a series of droughts, multi-year drought. And in 2017, they were getting very close to that day zero threshold. And in 2018, had the natural trend continued, they would have dipped below that. Reaching levels of conservation that they needed, like dramatically reducing water demand, would not have been possible without large-scale cooperation. So residents, business owners, other stakeholders being on the same team. And how do you do that? You do that with a lot of very cool information, education, and communication tools. And they did everything. They launched a web-based water map of usage based on meter readings. They created a dashboard for weekly updates on dam levels and consumption. They launched a calculator to educate consumers about their daily water use. So they tried a bunch of different tools concurrently, not only to inform people, but also to engage social norms and competition. Because if I know how much water I'm using compared to the next household, and if I know how much my neighborhood is using compared to the next neighborhood, this engages this like competitive aspect as well, which is a much more powerful driver of behavior change than just the awareness of the information. Now, I wish I could show you the water map. It's not active anymore. It's only a couple of the things that still are. But here's a screenshot that I took yesterday of that water dashboard. And you can see that actually they don't even have water use by group anymore, which is an interesting question as they move into their next dry period. Obviously not as bad as last year, but they're still going to face water restrictions of some sort that they clearly had part of the toolkit that was rolled out specifically as an ambitious day zero initiative. But here at least we can see in an engaging way how the dams are doing and also what water use is looking like overall. And these interventions continue to play a critical role during non-drought events, right? So these are the opportunities to reshape our relationships with water, because otherwise we go back to business as usual. We think of ourselves as being resilient. We think of water as being infinite, which in Canada, at least, is very core to our relationship with water. So thinking about this not just as a one-time campaign, but how do we continue to use this to inform our overall relationship? I want to highlight as well just the concept of day zero as a label, right? Because that is a very, very powerful, almost apocalyptic prevention frame. That's this very bad thing will happen if we reach 13.5%, and we need to not reach that 13.5%, which was very effective at the time. But as we're seeing in the context of coronavirus, there's only so long that can last, right? So physical distancing measures, for example, or getting people on site to say, yes, this is important enough that we will stay home, only lasts for a certain period of time before it starts to wear off, right? People get frustrated. People start to look at other considerations. People start to buy into other sources of authority. So if Cape Town were to relaunch day zero as a campaign this year, chances are it would be less effective. So looking both at how we use prevention frames for these very, very short-term responses, but also how we tie them into promotion frames for building this positive vision of we as Cape Town are a city where people have very efficient water usage and a very strong relationship to their water source. I want to wrap up with a few science communication best practices. I don't think the number 8 is the best practice, but I had a bunch and I wanted to make sure that I shared them all. So even if you're only taking a couple of these today, great. And then you can keep the rest to reference later. Define what science communication means to you. So this is really defining that purpose. Is it education? Is it behavior change? Is it for you as an individual getting more eyes on your work? Is it for your organization to build trust with the community? What does science communication mean, and what would success look like? Number 2, know and listen to your target audience. So just knowing your audience, having that sketched out as our ideal audience is this age demographic and this background doesn't stop there. It's really using your audience to inform your communication, build opportunities for dialogue, build opportunities for engagement. 3, plan a diverse communication portfolio. So communication box is not checked by writing a technical report. Chances are, if you're trying to engage a broad range of audiences, you're going to need a mix of communication tools, a mix of visuals, a mix of text, a mix of data, a range of communication tools. Number 4, be an honest broker. The most powerful thing you can do is to establish trust. If you have trust established, if people look to you as a source of authority on a particular issue, then they will come to you for information. And in this time of coronavirus, these honest brokers are the most powerful voices that we have. So it's not just about sharing information, it's about building that relationship and establishing trust. Number 5, understand the science of science communication. There's so much literature. I've provided at least one citation on almost every slide, and it's really just to highlight how much of a depth of best practices we do have. not only in general around science communication, but specifically around specific topics. So really refer to that or pull in people who have that background. 6, integrate science communication into your work. It is not a side of your desk activity. It is not as something that you do after the fact. It is really something that is core to a lot of the work that we do. 7, strive for dialogue, engagement, and participation. I chatted about that already. And finally, number 8, evaluate, reflect, and adapt. If we don't evaluate our communication, we have no mechanism for getting better. That is all. I've got a little bit of additional reading for you if you're interested once this gets sent out. But for now, let's open it up to questions. I do just want to throw a general invitation out there that you can reach me on Twitter if you like. You can also reach me by email. I am happy to connect you with folks in the science communication community or just help brainstorm. So if there's a particular topic and you're not sure how to approach it, I'm very happy to chat. So I'm going to open it up for questions. And I think, Meg, you're going to help me read them out.
Absolutely. Thank you for that presentation, Alan. So the first 2 questions we have are actually thanks for that presentation from Nisha and Francois Nicholas. Thank you guys for attending. We have a question from Jacqueline. You mentioned science is only one type of knowledge. How do you respectfully and efficiently acknowledge that when communicating scientific information, how do you respectfully and efficiently acknowledge that science is only one type of knowledge when you're communicating scientific information in a way that makes sense to a scientific audience and to a public audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing that I do personally is just use participatory processes, right? So when I'm standing on stage and speaking for an hour without asking questions, then whatever worldview that I'm coming from, if I'm a science communicator, then that is the worldview that's dominating the stage. But being more open to using the audiences in designing your communication. So if other forms of communication are really important in your discipline, then I would really encourage you as you're designing your science communication approach to get those people on side to say, hey, how do I have a conversation in a respectful way? So communication to me is always a dialogue. It's always based on input. And I encourage you to look for input from people who come from very different backgrounds, but are in that same space. And likewise, get input from your audience, because often people will have very, very different experiences and very different frames of reference. So to me, as a listening process, that is the best way to be respectful when you're dealing with other forms of communication and other frames of reference.
Thank you. We have a question from Adam. Do you have any suggestions for how to give an informative tour of a source watershed if the source is a river and not a reservoir, for instance?
Ooh, good question. I would think about what you're really sharing, right? Because is informative providing information, or is informative helping to build that connection, right? So to me, the tour part of it is probably more powerful than any information that you would share on that tour. So building those connections, building that relevance, and helping people understand the process that this water here is the water that comes out of your tap. Is just like a fundamentally different relationship. And in the work that I do with groundwater, that's what we're trying to do, is establish relationships with this very abstract water source that people can't visit. So I would really use the tools that you have in front of you, which is that concrete experience. And then just the understanding of vulnerability, right? People tend to look at big lakes and rivers as these things that are bigger than themselves, these things that are often like infallible in a way. But just talking about how, hey, we're looking at this lake and river, we can see things trickling into it, we can see things interacting with it. When we talk about water security and water supply, these are really big inputs. So I would encourage you to think about that.
Thank you. Our next question is from Rob. What role do you think art does play and can play in science communication?
Oh, I love that. Science art, or sci art, as the cool kids call it, is a really quickly growing I would call it an arm of science communication. Probably a lot of people would disagree with me on that and say that it's its own domain. When we're trying to have that emotional conversation, when we're trying to think about ways that we communicate that isn't just based on information, we understand the world in very different ways when we look at art. So, yes, I totally agree with you. Whether that's art in an abstract sense, whether that's just, that photo of Moraine Lake that I showed at the beginning, right? That is a very different connection to talking about a watershed than just looking at watershed data. So for sure. And I encourage you to check out some of the resources that I shared around mental models, because there's a lot of the psychology literature that's tied to in terms of the emotional versus the rational side of communication and how you can use both when designing communication.
Thank you. Another question from a question from Julianne. How do you communicate effectively through different medium like social media, websites, newsletters, with an audience that's mixed, that consists of both climate change deniers and climate change believers?
Hmm. That's a good question. And actually, I will plug Catherine Hayhoe, who I mentioned as being a leader in the field of climate change communication. Her work focuses so much on building shared values and building trust across the political spectrum, particularly with sort of folks who don't have that same stance on climate, perhaps, that we might. So the approach there, oh, by the way, sorry, I was going to plug, there's a talk next week that she's giving that I'm giving with her, which is awesome. I'm chatting about water, she's chatting about climate, and it is a public talk which you can access wherever you are, which is called Pint of Science. And I think Meg will share the link to that in the thread. So I really suggest checking that out and checking out her work. She's given a great TED talk on this as well. But changing the frame of reference from what is more powerful? Is it establishing that communication channel, or is it sharing information? And I would make the case that if you establish trust and if you establish shared values and if you are able to establish a common ground as humans who care about the world in which we live, then that is a much, much, much more powerful tool in your toolkit than just sharing information about climate change. So I would think through what it is that's going to change those people's opinions, what it is that's going to engage those people. And it really is those relationships. And what we're seeing in the climate change communication research is that a lot of minds are changed by friends and family, disproportionately are changed by friends and family, right? So having those trust relationships and establishing that we are all humans and we're all in this together is so powerful.
Thank you. We still have time for a couple more questions if anyone wants to ask any more. I have a question for you. Do you have any recommendations for how we can communicate the uncertainty around our science?
Ooh, that is a great one. And that is actually particularly around coronavirus, something that's been a very active conversation. What is the role of science in communicating uncertainty? The very simple answer is we should communicate uncertainty, but we need to contextualize uncertainty because uncertainty means very different things within the scientific community and elsewhere. So, as a scientific community broadly, I think there needs to be more streamlining in how we agree to communicate uncertainty. And there's a lot of frameworks. And one group that's doing a great
Mhm.
job on that is Evidence for Democracy, which is based in Ottawa, looking at how do we communicate uncertainty around research. But it really is contextualizing the concept of uncertainty, framing the concept of uncertainty. So it's not just uncertainty equals I don't know, it's uncertainty equals this science is still evolving, but I know enough to make this educated guess based on where we are today.
Awesome. Thank you for that resource. We have a question from Robin. What recommendations do you have for young scientists looking to grow their communication skills?
Get creative. One of the weirdest toolkits that I've stumbled on that I think has really shaped me as a communicator was taking improv classes, which really opened me up to connecting with audience, to listening, to being open and spontaneous as a communicator. So I would say look in the world for the communicators that you want to emulate and try to build toolkits based on what they've done. There's a lot of organizations that are just now starting, particularly in the environmental space, to weave communication into the work that they do. So I would really just encourage you to look for, in the most broad and creative way, what kind of communication tools you can have in your toolkit and what organizations are doing a great job. And then I would say that a lot of young science communicators are in this cool position where you're learning tools now, for example, animation, that people in the industry might not know. So whatever tool you're using, you're learning, use it, right? Build your portfolio, put content out into the world. If you're good at making maps, make maps. If you're good at infographics, make infographics. And that is a great way to both get practice, but also get exposure and have people recognize you as someone who has that skill set.
Thank you. A question from Veronique. Do you have some short suggestions for communicating science with Indigenous communities and maintaining those long-term communication channels, maybe what to do or what not to do?
Short suggestions, yes. But I would encourage you to look for a lot of the best practices around engagement with Indigenous communities. I would say that, particularly in that context where there is a lot of history and relationships are the most powerful thing that you can build, it's okay if your communication exercise is not about information at all, right? And a lot of the people who do work in the environmental space with Indigenous communities rely on relationships that they've been building for years. So disconnecting from communication as an exercise, succeeding if you have shared information, and looking at it more as, what is a way in which I can continue to share information? What is a way in which I can genuinely listen? And when I say genuinely listen, it means not coming in from a perspective of I have information to share, but coming in from a perspective of there's another worldview here. And the work that I do with this group is going to be informed by being able to listen to that worldview and weave it into the work. So reframing the communication exercise about not just sharing information, but building relationships and genuinely listening and creating opportunities for participation. But a huge body of literature, a lot of organizations that are doing great work in this space.
Thank you. We have a question from Eric. What has been your most frustrating science communication challenge, and how did you approach it and deal with it?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I think my most frustrating science communication challenge has been the fact that communication for most people continues to be a side of your desk focus. So I knew early on that communication was something I was really passionate about, even though I was a technical professional. But repeatedly, when I would suggest, hey, instead of writing a report, or in addition to writing a report, why don't we put an infographic out there? Why don't we do something that's more engaging? There was always this, well, we don't have the budget for it. Well, it's not on scope. But the issue is that it's never on scope because the people who define the scope aren't coming from the perspective of science communication is important. So I think those systemic issues to me have been the biggest frustrations. And it's why I've tried to build this portfolio at once of being a water professional and a science communication professional, which in many cases has been two very different exercises and two very different hats that I wear. And now that I have that experience, I'm starting to see the opportunities to put science communication back into our conversations around water and around climate. So that's my frustration point, is that communication just hasn't been baked into the system of a lot of the technical conversations we have. And because of that, there's a lot of opportunities that we miss.
Thank you. And last question for today. Do you have any recommendations for communicating proactive management, like people taking actions based on science?
Um, Not education. I think
Hmm.
it takes a little bit of changing our perspective from I'm trying to educate you to I'm trying to engage you. And that means something very different, right? So if you're coming at it from a perspective of I want to educate people so they make better decisions, I would encourage you to sit in the work you're doing and sit in the purpose of that work and ask yourself, is education really the appropriate toolkit here? Or are there engagement strategies that I can look to pull people in? In which case, the thing you're sharing again might not be about the information. It might just be about building that relationship between people and the environment. And fundamentally, people are amazing stewards of their local environments. It's just about contextualizing the information within that existing relationship and helping to develop it.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time with all the questions today. We had some really great questions, and thank you all for attending and asking questions. And thank you for presenting again today, Alan.
And thanks, Meg. And all of you, feel free to reach out to me if you've got any more questions. I'm always happy to chat.
Great. Have a good afternoon, everyone.